She was wiping down a marble countertop when the man in the $700 suit snapped his fingers at her. Not a wave. Not a polite gesture. A snap. Like calling a dog. She looked up, her hands still wet with cleaning solution, and watched him point at a spot on the floor near his Italian leather shoes. "You missed something," he said, not even looking at her face. Just pointed. Just expected. And in that moment, standing in a hotel lobby worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, wearing a uniform that made her invisible, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt what it meant to be nobody. But here's what that man didn't know, what none of them knew. The woman holding that cleaning rag owned every single inch of that building. Every chandelier. Every marble tile. Every thread in every carpet. She was worth $470 million. And she was about to meet the only man who would change everything she thought she understood about human nature, about love, and about who people really are when they think no one important is watching. Stay until the end, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about the people around you. If you enjoy real, emotional stories that reveal hidden truths about people, subscribe now. This channel is built for stories like this. Now, let me ask you something before we continue. Have you ever wondered what people would say about you if they thought you weren't listening? Have you ever wanted to know who would treat you well when you had absolutely nothing to offer them? These aren't just philosophical questions. For one woman, they became an obsession. And that obsession led her to make a decision that most people would call insane. She erased herself. Completely. Walked away from penthouses and private jets and people who said her name with reverence. She became a night shift cleaner in her own hotel. And what she discovered in those shadowed hallways, in those early morning hours when the world thought she was nobody, would break her heart and rebuild it in ways she never saw coming. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story begins not with the disguise, but with the reason behind it. Her name, for the purposes of this story, was Eleanor. Eleanor Hartwell. She didn't build her fortune from scratch. That's important to understand. She inherited it. Her grandfather had been a real estate developer in the 1950s, the kind of man who saw empty coastline and imagined empires. Her father expanded that empire. And when he died, unexpectedly, from a heart attack at 59, Eleanor was 28 years old and suddenly in control of assets worth more than $300 million. She wasn't unprepared. She had an MBA from Wharton. She understood balance sheets and market dynamics. But nothing prepares you for the way people look at you when they know your net worth before they know your middle name. The first man who proposed to her did it 3 months after her father's funeral. They'd been dating for 6 months. He was handsome, charming, worked in finance. He took her to an expensive restaurant, got down on one knee, and offered her a ring that cost less than the watch she was wearing. She said yes because she wanted to believe love could still be real. The engagement lasted 4 months. She found emails. Plans. A prenuptial agreement he'd drafted with his lawyer before he'd even proposed, one that gave him $20 million if the marriage lasted more than 5 years. He wasn't even embarrassed when she confronted him. He just shrugged and said, "You can't blame a guy for being practical." That was the first crack. The second man was different. He was older, a professor, someone who seemed to care about ideas more than money. He never asked her for anything. Never pushed. They dated for almost 2 years. She thought maybe this was it. Then one night, at a dinner party, she overheard him talking to a colleague. He didn't know she was standing just outside the room. The colleague asked him if he was serious about her. And he laughed. Actually laughed. He said, "Serious? I'm dating a woman worth hundreds of millions. I'd be an idiot not to be serious." Eleanor didn't confront him. She just ended it the next day. Sent a text. Blocked his number. And something inside her went cold. After that, she stopped dating. Stopped trusting. Started running her business with ruthless precision. She acquired 2 more hotels. Expanded into commercial real estate. Made decisions that made her richer and more isolated. She lived in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the ocean. 1,400 square feet of marble and glass and silence. She employed a chef, a housekeeper, a personal assistant. People who were paid to care. And every single night, she sat alone at a dining table built for 8, eating meals prepared by someone who called her Miss Hartwell and never once asked how her day had been. Not really. Not the way people ask when they actually care about the answer. She kept journals. Dozens of them. Leather-bound, expensive, filled with thoughts she couldn't say out loud. In one entry, dated March 14, 3 years before the events of this story, she wrote, "I don't think I'm afraid of being alone. I think I'm afraid that everyone who says they love me is just waiting for me to write them into the will." That fear became the foundation of everything that came next. She started testing people. Small things at first. She'd tell a date she was thinking of donating her entire fortune to charity, just to see how they'd react. She'd pretend her accountant had made a mistake, that she'd lost millions in a bad investment, just to watch their faces. And every single time, she saw it. The flicker. The recalculation. The moment when love became math. So she made a decision. If she couldn't trust people to love her for who she was, she'd find out who they really were when they thought she was nobody. She'd strip away every advantage. Every signal of wealth. Every piece of armor. And she'd see, truly see, how people treated someone they thought had no power at all. That's how the experiment began. She owned a hotel, newly renovated, on the coast of a mid-sized American city. Not a major tourist destination, but respectable. The kind of place where business travelers stayed during the week and couples celebrated anniversaries on weekends. It had 140 rooms, a restaurant, a small spa. She'd invested $18 million into the renovation. It was her pride. Her design. Her vision brought to life. And she was going to work there as a cleaner. Her lawyer thought she'd lost her mind. Her CFO threatened to quit. Her personal assistant just stared at her like she'd announced she was joining a cult. But Eleanor didn't care. She'd already made up her mind. She met with the hotel's general manager, a man named Peter Calhoun, someone she'd hired 8 months earlier. She told him the plan. He was sworn to secrecy. He'd lose his job, his career, everything, if he told a single person. He looked at her like she was conducting some kind of psychological experiment. Which, in a way, she was. She wanted to know how her staff really operated. How guests were really treated. What happened in the spaces between the performance and the reality. Peter helped her create a fake identity. New name, Elena Vasquez. Background, recent immigrant, limited English, cleaning experience at a motel chain. No red flags. No reasons for anyone to look twice. She applied through the normal channels. Submitted a resume. Did a phone interview with the HR coordinator, a tired-sounding woman named Jessica who barely asked any questions. She was hired in 6 days. Her first shift was a Wednesday night. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The night crew. She showed up in black pants and a white polo shirt with the hotel logo embroidered on the chest. Her hair pulled back in a tight bun. No makeup. Sneakers that cost $12 from a discount store. She walked into the staff entrance at the back of the building, the same building she'd stood inside a year ago with architects and designers, pointing at fabric samples and arguing about lighting fixtures. Now she was clocking in on a machine that beeped when she scanned her badge. Her supervisor was a woman in her 50s named Diane. Thick Boston accent. Tired eyes. Diane barely looked at her. Just handed her a supply cart and said, "You're on the 4th floor tonight. Rooms 401 through 420. Strip the beds, clean the bathrooms, vacuum, restock. You get 30 minutes for lunch at 3 a.m. Don't take longer." Eleanor nodded. Said thank you in a soft voice with just a trace of an accent. And she got to work. The first room she cleaned was 401. A standard queen. The guest had checked out that morning. There were towels on the bathroom floor. Toothpaste smeared on the sink. An empty wine bottle on the nightstand. She put on gloves and started scrubbing. It took her 40 minutes to clean that one room. She'd never cleaned a bathroom in her life. Not like this. She didn't know the tricks. Didn't know the rhythm. By the time she finished the third room, her back was aching. Her hands smelled like chemicals. And she realized something that made her feel ashamed. She'd walked past people doing this work 1,000 times and never once thought about what it actually felt like. By 5 a.m., she'd finished 12 rooms. She sat in the staff break room, a windowless box with fluorescent lights and a vending machine that only took coins. Diane came in, poured herself coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there since yesterday, and said, "You're slow. You need to pick up the pace or you won't make it past probation." Eleanor nodded. Said she'd do better. Diane walked out without another word. That first week was the hardest week of Eleanor's life. Harder than business school. Harder than her father's funeral. Harder than any boardroom negotiation. Her body hurt in ways she didn't know were possible. But worse than the pain was the invisibility. Guests walked past her in the hallways and didn't make eye contact. Managers spoke to her in short, clipped sentences, like she couldn't understand full paragraphs. One morning, a guest stopped her in the hall and pointed at a stain on the carpet. Didn't say hello. Didn't say please. Just pointed and said, "Fix that." But she kept going. Because she was learning. She learned that the morning shift supervisor, a man named Kyle, talked differently to the cleaning staff than he did to the front desk team. Sweeter to the people guests could see. Harsher to the people they couldn't. She learned that two of the housekeepers, Maria and Lynn, shared an apartment and split shifts so one could take care of Lynn's mother who had dementia. She learned that the maintenance guy, a man in his early 60s everyone called Ricky, would slip extra snacks from the supply closet to any staff member he thought looked hungry. And then, 3 weeks into her experiment, she met the man who would change everything. His name was David. David Porter. He wasn't part of the core hotel staff. He was a contractor. Brought in to handle repairs the in-house maintenance couldn't manage. Plumbing issues. Electrical problems. He'd been working at the hotel for about 2 months, long before Eleanor started her undercover work. She first noticed him on a Thursday morning, just before her shift ended. She was emptying trash from a hallway bin on the 2nd floor. He was kneeling outside room 214, fixing a door that wouldn't latch properly. He looked up when she walked by. Made eye contact. Smiled. Said, "Morning." Not "good morning," in that performance way people say it when they don't mean it. Just "morning." Like she was a person. Like it mattered that she was there. She nodded, said it back, kept walking. But something about that moment stayed with her. The next time she saw him, he was in the basement, repairing a water heater. She was down there looking for extra cleaning supplies. He was on his back, halfway under the tank, wrench in hand. He heard her footsteps and slid out, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You need something?" he asked. She explained she was looking for the extra vacuum bags. He stood up, walked over to a shelf she hadn't noticed, and handed her a box. "They hide the good stuff down here," he said with a small grin. Took me 2 weeks to figure out where everything was. She thanked him. Started to walk away. Then he said, "You're new, right?" She turned. "Yeah. About a month." He nodded. "It gets easier. The work, I mean. Your body adjusts." There was no condescension in his voice. No pity. Just kindness. She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled and left. Over the next few weeks, they kept running into each other. The hotel wasn't huge. Night shift staff was small. It was inevitable. But what wasn't inevitable was the way he always acknowledged her. Always said hello. Always treated her like she mattered. One night, she was cleaning the third-floor hallway, and a guest came out of his room, clearly drunk, and started yelling at her. Said she'd woken him up with the vacuum. It was 2 a.m. She hadn't been anywhere near his room. But he didn't care. He stood there in a hotel bathrobe, face red, calling her incompetent, telling her he was going to get her fired. She just stood there, frozen. And then David came around the corner. He'd been fixing a leaking sink in the room next door. He walked up, calm, hands in his pockets, and said to the guest, "Hey man, I've been making all the noise. Pipe issue. She's just doing her job." The guest turned his anger on David for a second, but David didn't flinch. Just kept his voice level. Reasonable. Eventually, the guest muttered something and went back into his room. David looked at Eleanor and said, "You okay?" She nodded, throat tight. He smiled. "People get weird at night. Don't take it personal." Then he went back to work. That moment mattered. Not because he'd saved her from some dramatic confrontation, but because he'd seen her as someone worth defending. Later that week, they took their breaks at the same time by accident. The break room was empty except for the two of them. He was eating a sandwich he'd brought from home. She had a cup of tea. They didn't talk much at first. Then he asked where she was from. She gave him the backstory she'd prepared. Raised in New Mexico. Moved here for work. He nodded. Told her he'd grown up about 40 minutes north. Worked construction most of his life. His wife had passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. He said it simply. Not looking for sympathy. Just stating a fact. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She didn't know what to say. So she just said, "I'm sorry." He nodded. "Yeah. Me too." They sat in silence for a minute. Then he said, "You got family here?" She shook her head. "No. Just me." He looked at her for a moment, something soft in his expression. "That's hard," he said. And somehow, those 2 words meant more than all the polite condolences she'd heard at charity galas and business dinners. After that, they started talking more. Nothing deep. Nothing romantic. Just the kind of conversations people have when they work nights and the world feels quiet. He told her about his daughter, who was in college studying engineering. Told her he was proud but broke from tuition payments. Told her he picked up contractor work at hotels because the pay was better than standard construction gigs. She told him small truths, wrapped in lies. Said she'd worked a lot of jobs. Said she liked the quiet of night shifts. Said she didn't have many friends here yet. He said, "Well, you got at least one now." And he meant it. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop your state or country in the comments. I'm reading every one. Now here's where the story starts to shift. Because Eleanor was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous. She was beginning to care. Not about the experiment. Not about what she was learning. About him. She started adjusting her schedule to be on the same floors he was working. Started timing her breaks to match his. Started looking forward to those quiet conversations in the break room at 3 in the morning. And the more she got to know him, the more she realized he was everything the men in her real life weren't. He didn't perform. Didn't posture. Didn't try to impress her. He talked about his daughter with pride that had nothing to do with status. He talked about his late wife with grief that wasn't theatrical. He helped other staff members without expecting credit. One night, she saw him give his dinner to one of the younger housekeepers, a kid named Marcus who'd mentioned he'd forgotten to eat before his shift. David just handed him the container and said, "I'm not that hungry anyway." Marcus tried to refuse, but David insisted. Eleanor watched from the hallway. Felt something crack open inside her chest. Because she realized she was falling for him. And he had no idea who she really was. The guilt started small. A whisper in the back of her mind during their conversations. "You're lying to him. He thinks you're someone you're not." But she pushed it away. Told herself this was the whole point. To see who people really were. To find someone who would treat her well without knowing what she had. Except it wasn't an experiment anymore. It was real. And that made everything so much more complicated. 2 months into her time as Elena Vasquez, something happened that forced her hand. A guest complained. A woman staying in room 512 said her room hadn't been cleaned properly. Said there was dust on the nightstand and hair in the bathroom. It wasn't Eleanor's room. It was one of the other cleaners, a woman named Sandra who was struggling because her son was sick and she'd been working double shifts to pay his medical bills. But the complaint went up the chain. And the hotel's assistant manager, a man named Trevor who Eleanor had always found oily and performative, decided to make an example. He called a staff meeting at the end of the night shift. Made everyone stand in the break room. And he laid into Sandra in front of everyone. Told her she was lazy. Told her she was lucky to have a job. Told her one more complaint and she was gone. Sandra just stood there, eyes down, taking it. Eleanor felt rage rise in her throat. She wanted to say something. Wanted to step in. But she couldn't. Because Elena Vasquez had no power. Elena Vasquez was nobody. Then David spoke up. He was leaning against the wall in the back. He said, calm and clear, "Trevor, she's been working doubles. She's doing the best she can." Trevor turned on him. "I don't remember asking for your input, Porter." David didn't back down. "Yeah, well, I'm giving it anyway. Sandra's a good worker. One guest complaint doesn't change that." Trevor's face went red. "You want to join her on the chopping block?" David shrugged. "If that's what it takes to treat people with respect, sure." The room went silent. Trevor stared at him. Then he muttered something about insubordination and walked out. Sandra looked at David with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." David just nodded. "Don't worry about it." Eleanor stood there, heart pounding. Because in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She didn't just care about him. She loved him. And he had no idea who she really was. That night, she couldn't sleep. She went home to her penthouse, stood in front of those floor-to-ceiling windows, and stared out at the ocean. She'd gotten what she wanted. She'd found someone who treated people well when he thought no one important was watching. Someone who stood up for others. Someone who was kind not because it benefited him, but because it was who he was. But now she had a problem. Because if she told him the truth, she'd lose him. He'd spoken before, casually, about rich people. About how they didn't understand what it was like to choose between paying rent and fixing your car. About how they lived in a different world. He'd never said it with bitterness. Just fact. But she knew. If he found out she'd been lying, that she'd been testing him, that she was one of those rich people he talked about, he'd see it as betrayal. And he'd be right. So she kept the secret. Kept going to work. Kept pretending. And every conversation felt like walking a tightrope. 3.5 months in, David asked her if she wanted to grab coffee sometime. Outside of work. She said yes before she could stop herself. They met at a diner 2 blocks from the hotel. 6 in the morning, right after their shift ended. He ordered eggs and toast. She ordered oatmeal. They sat in a booth by the window and talked for 2 hours. He told her about his childhood. About how his dad had been a mechanic and taught him everything he knew about fixing things. About how he'd met his wife at a county fair when he was 19. About how they'd struggled for years, but they'd been happy. She told him stories from the life she'd invented. And hated herself a little more with every word. But she also felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. Not as Eleanor Hartwell, billionaire. Not as a bank account or a business asset. Just as a person. He asked her questions. Listened to her answers. Laughed at her jokes. At the end, when they stood up to leave, he said, "We should do this again." She smiled. "I'd like that." And she meant it. Over the next month, they fell into a routine. Coffee after shifts. Conversations that stretched longer each time. He never tried to kiss her. Never made it weird. Just genuine companionship. But Eleanor knew it couldn't last. She was still running a company. Still had board meetings and investor calls and decisions that affected hundreds of employees. She was living 2 lives, and the seams were starting to show. One morning, after a particularly long shift, she got back to her penthouse and found 6 missed calls from her CFO. A deal was falling apart. She had to take a video meeting in 2 hours. She showed up on camera in a blazer and makeup, pretending she hadn't just spent 8 hours scrubbing toilets. After the meeting, she sat on her couch and put her head in her hands. This was unsustainable. She had to make a choice. End the experiment and disappear. Or tell him the truth and risk everything. Before she could decide, the choice was made for her. It happened on a Wednesday night. Eleanor was cleaning the lobby bathrooms, the ones near the main entrance. It was around 1 a.m. The lobby was mostly empty except for the night desk staff. Then she heard raised voices. She stepped out into the hallway and saw a scene unfolding near the front desk. A guest, a man in an expensive suit, was yelling at one of the night clerks, a young woman named Amy. He was furious because his room wasn't ready. He'd arrived 4 hours early and expected them to accommodate him. Amy was apologizing, trying to explain hotel policy. The man didn't care. He called her incompetent. Called her worthless. His voice was loud enough to echo through the marble lobby. And then Eleanor saw movement. David, coming down the main staircase. He'd been fixing something on the 2nd floor. He walked over, calm as ever. "Sir, she's doing her job. The room will be ready at check-in time." The man turned on him. "Who the hell are you?" David didn't flinch. "I work here. And I'm telling you, yelling at her isn't going to make the room ready faster." The man's face went purple. He started making threats. Said he'd call corporate. Said he'd get everyone fired. David just stood there, hands in his pockets, unmoved. Then the man said something that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice. He looked at Amy and said, "Do you know who I am? I could buy this entire hotel." And David, without missing a beat, said, "Then maybe you should. Because right now, you're just a guy being rude to someone who doesn't deserve it." The man sputtered. Demanded to see a manager. Amy, shaking, called the night manager. The situation eventually de-escalated. The man was given a sweet upgrade just to shut him up. But Eleanor stood in the hallway, watching David, and realized something. She was about to lose him. Because in 2 days, there was a scheduled board meeting at the hotel. She had to be there. As herself. And the second she walked into that building as Eleanor Hartwell, everyone would know. Including him. She thought about canceling. Thought about moving the meeting. But she couldn't. There were investors flying in. Contracts being signed. She had responsibilities. So she made a decision. She'd tell him first. Before the meeting. Before he found out from someone else. She'd tell him the truth and hope that the months they'd spent together, the person she'd been with him, mattered more than the lie. She asked him to meet her at the diner. Same booth. Early morning after their shift. He showed up with a smile, coffee already ordered for both of them. She couldn't smile back. He noticed immediately. You okay? She took a breath. And she told him. Everything. Her real name. Her real life. The experiment. The reasons. The fear. The loneliness. The need to know if someone could care about her without knowing what she had. She told him she hadn't planned to fall for him. That it had become real. That she was sorry for lying but she didn't know how to stop. He listened without interrupting. His face didn't change. When she finished, there was silence. Then he stood up. Put $20 on the table. And walked out. She sat there, tears streaming down her face, and watched him disappear into the morning light. The board meeting happened 2 days later. Eleanor walked into her own hotel in a tailored suit and heels. Hair professionally styled. The version of herself the world expected. The staff who'd worked alongside her as Elena stopped in their tracks. Diane, her supervisor, went pale. Trevor, the assistant manager who'd berated Sandra, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Peter, the general manager, met her in the lobby. Whispered, "How did it go?" She just shook her head. The meeting was efficient. Professional. She sat at the head of the table, discussed quarterly earnings, approved new initiatives. Played the role she'd been trained for. But her mind was somewhere else. After the meeting, she went looking for him. Asked Peter if David was in the building. Peter hesitated. Then said, "He quit. Sent an email this morning. Said he was taking a job out of state." Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. She went back to her penthouse. Sat in the silence. And realized what she'd done. She'd wanted to know if someone could love her for who she was. But in trying to find that, she'd become someone else entirely. And the one person who'd seen her, really seen her, was gone. Weeks passed. She threw herself into work. Expanded her business. Made more money. It didn't matter. She kept thinking about that diner. About the look on his face. About the way he'd just walked away. Then, 2 months later, she got a letter. Hand-delivered to her office. No return address. She opened it. It was from David. The letter was short. It said, "I was angry. Not because of the money. But because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. I've thought about it a lot. And I realized something. You were trying to protect yourself. I get that. I did the same thing after my wife died. Pushed people away because it hurt less than risking more loss. But here's the thing. You didn't need to pretend to be someone else for me to care about you. The person I met in that hotel, the one who worked hard and listened and laughed at my bad jokes, that was real. I don't care about the money. I never did. But I do care about honesty. So if you still want to try this, really try, I'm willing. But no more lies. No more tests. Just 2 people trying to figure it out. I'm staying at the Bluebird Motel on Route 9. Room 14. If you show up, I'll know you mean it. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she grabbed her keys, drove across town, pulled into the parking lot of a motel that had seen better days, knocked on the door of room 14. David opened it, looked at her for a long moment, then stepped aside. She walked in. The room was small. A bed, a television, a chair by the window. He closed the door. They stood there, facing each other. And she said, "No more lies." He nodded. No more lies. They didn't kiss. Didn't fall into each other's arms like some movie scene. They just sat down. And they talked. Really talked. 4 hours. She told him about the loneliness. About the failed relationships. About the fear that no one would ever see past the money. He told her about the grief. About raising his daughter alone. About the anger he'd felt when he realized she'd been lying. But also about the moments that had mattered. The conversations. The way she'd made him feel seen too. By the time the sun came up, they'd built something new. Not based on pretense. Not based on experiment. Just 2 people, broken in different ways, willing to try. 6 months later, they were still together. She'd scaled back her work. Hired people she trusted. Started actually living instead of just performing. He'd gone back to contracting, but on his terms. They lived simply. Split their time between her penthouse and a small house he owned near the coast. Her friends from the business world didn't understand. Her board members raised eyebrows. But she didn't care. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't measuring love by what someone wanted from her. She was measuring it by how someone made her feel. And David made her feel human. One evening, they were sitting on the porch of his house, watching the ocean. She said, "Do you ever regret it? Getting involved with all this?" He thought for a moment. Then said, "I regret that you felt like you had to hide. But I don't regret you." She leaned her head on his shoulder. And realized something. The experiment had worked. Just not the way she'd planned. She'd wanted to find out who people really were when they thought she was nobody. And she'd learned. But the bigger lesson was about herself. She'd spent so long hiding behind wealth and walls that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. To be seen. To let someone in without armor. David had given her that. Not because he didn't know who she was. But because he cared about who she was trying to be. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If someone treats you well when they think you're nobody, that tells you everything. But what does it say about you if you only let people see you when you think you're safe? Would you have told him the truth sooner, or kept the secret? Comment below. I'm reading every response. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about love, about power, about the masks we all wear, subscribe now. This channel is for those who notice what others overlook. Because the next story will stay with you even longer. Thanks for watching. And remember, the people who see you when you think you're invisible, those are the ones worth keeping.